The Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years, then it fell apart in about 10. This video explains how that happened. Think of the empire in three parts. First, a tiny frontier state that grew into a world power. Second, an empire so strong it ruled 3 continents at once. Third, 200 years of slowly losing ground, piece by piece. That slow decline ended with one final decision that brought it all down. Let's start at the beginning. In 1299, a small Turkish leader named Osman I ruled a modest piece of land in northwest Anatolia. His territory was tiny. It bordered a much older power, the Byzantine Empire. That empire had once ruled most of the Mediterranean world. By 1299, it was fading fast. Osman's small territory sat right at the edge of that fading power. It was about to grow into something much bigger. His successors expanded steadily, generation after generation. They took the city of Bursa in 1326 and made it their first real capital. By the 1350s, they had crossed the water into Europe for the first time. In 1389, they defeated Serbian forces at the Battle of Kosovo. That battle broke Serbian resistance in the region for decades. This was not a sudden rise to power. It took over 150 years of slow, patient growth. Each ruler added a little more land. Each ruler built a little more strength. By the early 1400s, the Ottomans controlled large parts of the Balkans and most of Anatolia. Part of that strength came from a unique military system. Young boys from conquered Christian families were sometimes taken and trained as soldiers. They became known as janissaries, an elite fighting force loyal directly to the Sultan. This system gave the Ottomans a professional standing army centuries before most European kingdoms had one. It was unusual, and by modern standards it was harsh. But it helped explain why Ottoman armies kept winning. Then, in 1453, everything changed at once. Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. That city had stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Its walls had turned back armies for centuries. Mehmed built massive cannons just to break through them. Some of those cannons were nearly 30 feet long. The siege lasted 53 days. Mehmed was only 21 years old at the time. His army has been estimated at somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers. Historians disagree on the exact number, since Byzantine and Ottoman records do not fully match. What is certain is the result. The 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire was gone. Constantinople became the new Ottoman capital. Later, the city would be called Istanbul. This single conquest gave the Ottomans something enormous. It gave them control of the trade routes connecting Europe and Asia. Goods, money, and merchants now had to pass through Ottoman hands. And this was only the beginning. The empire was about to grow faster than almost anyone in Europe expected. In 1517, Sultan Selim I conquered Egypt in a single military campaign. He also took control of Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest cities in Islam. This gave the Ottoman Sultan religious authority that stretched far beyond his own borders. From this point on, the Sultan was seen as protector of those 2 cities. That title carried enormous weight across the Muslim world. His son took the throne next. His name was Suleiman I. Europeans called him the Magnificent. His own people called him the Lawgiver. He ruled from 1520 to 1566. That was the longest and most powerful reign in Ottoman history, lasting 46 years. Suleiman pushed deep into Hungary and crushed its army at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. In 1529, he laid siege to Vienna itself, the capital of the Austrian Habsburgs. His navy controlled much of the Mediterranean Sea through admirals like Barbarossa. But his real achievement was not just conquest. It was what he built at home during years of peace. He organized the empire's legal system into clear, lasting codes that governed daily life. He built grand mosques, schools, hospitals, and public fountains across the empire. The architect Mimar Sinan designed many of these buildings, and some still stand in Istanbul today. This is the version of the Ottoman Empire most people picture. Wealthy, stable, and impossible for its neighbors to ignore. The empire also ran something called the millet system. Under this system, Christians, Jews, and Muslims all lived under one government. Each religious group had its own courts to handle its own legal and family matters. It was not full equality by modern standards, but it let a hugely diverse empire hold together for centuries, without constant religious war. The empire also managed its land through a system called the timar. Local officials were given the right to collect taxes from a piece of land. In exchange, they had to supply soldiers and equipment whenever the Sultan called for war. This meant the empire could raise large armies quickly, without keeping a huge standing force at all times. It was efficient, and for a long time it worked extremely well. At its height, the city of Istanbul itself may have held close to 500,000 people. That made it one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth at the time. Its markets connected spices from Asia, cloth from Europe, and grain from Egypt in a single trading network. This was not a backward or fading power. It was one of the wealthiest and most connected states in the world. By 1683, the empire had reached its largest size. It covered roughly 5.2 million square kilometers. That land stretched across parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa at the same time. From Algeria in the west to Iraq in the east. From Hungary in the north to Yemen in the south. Few empires in history have controlled that much territory across 3 continents at once. But 1683 is also the year everything started to turn. That year, the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna for a second time. A combined European army, including Polish forces led by King John Sobieski, arrived and broke the siege. The retreating Ottoman army lost momentum it had held for over 300 years. It would never fully recover that momentum again. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz was signed. For the first time in Ottoman history, the empire formally gave up major territory. Hungary went to Austria under the terms of that treaty. It was the first real crack in a wall that had stood, mostly unbroken, for centuries. Over the next 200 years, that crack widened again and again. Greece fought a long war and won its independence in 1830. Serbia and Romania gained formal recognition as independent states in 1878. By the early 1900s, European powers had a nickname for the whole empire. They called it the sick man of Europe, a phrase meant to describe slow, visible decline. The empire did try to fix its problems during this period. Starting in 1839, a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat tried to modernize the government. Officials rewrote laws, reorganized the army, and tried to build a more equal system for all citizens. Some of these reforms genuinely helped, but they were expensive, and the empire had to borrow heavily from European banks to pay for them. That borrowing is part of what led to the debt crisis later on. The Crimean War, fought from 1853 to 1856, showed the same pattern clearly. The Ottomans technically won that war, with help from Britain and France, but the cost of fighting it forced the empire to take out its first major foreign loans. Each war after that added more debt on top of the last one. Victory on the battlefield did not mean victory for the treasury. Nationalist movements were also growing inside the empire's own borders during this same period. Groups across the Balkans wanted their own separate countries. Arab groups in the Middle East wanted greater independence from Istanbul. Armenian communities in the East pushed for greater rights and protection. The empire that once held so many peoples together under one system was slowly starting to come apart from within. The empire was not just losing land during these years. It was also losing control of its own money. By 1881, its debts to European banks had grown so large they could not be repaid on normal terms. An outside group called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was created to manage the crisis. Its job was to collect certain Ottoman taxes directly on behalf of foreign lenders. Those collected taxes went first to pay European banks and bondholders. This meant a foreign-run body was managing a large share of Ottoman government income. The empire had lost financial control of itself well before it lost most of its territory. That is an easy detail to miss, but it mattered enormously. By 1913, this pressure reached a breaking point. The First and Second Balkan Wars had just come to an end. In under 2 years of fighting, the empire lost most of its remaining European territory. A stretch of land it had held for over 500 years was gone almost overnight, leaving Istanbul dangerously exposed. Before those wars, the Ottoman Empire had controlled most of southeastern Europe. After them, it held only a small strip of land around Istanbul itself. Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro had all taken pieces of that former territory. For an empire that had once besieged Vienna, this loss was staggering. It signaled to every European power that the empire could no longer defend its own borders. Then, in 1914, the empire made a decision that turned a slow decline into a fast collapse. By this point, real power in the empire belonged to three men, not to the Sultan himself. They were known as the Three Pashas: Enver, Talat, and Cemal. They had taken effective control after a revolution in 1908 that limited the Sultan's authority. In late October of 1914, they made their choice for the empire. It joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The fighting spread across multiple fronts almost immediately. Ottoman forces fought Russian troops in the Caucasus Mountains in brutal winter conditions. At the Battle of Sarıkamış alone, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers died. Many of them died from the cold, not from combat. They fought British forces across the Middle East, from Iraq to Palestine. They fought British and Allied troops at Gallipoli. That campaign lasted nearly a year. It cost both sides enormous casualties. Territory and manpower slipped away on almost every front at once. During this same war, the Ottoman government carried out mass killings of its Armenian population. This began in the spring of 1915, alongside large-scale forced deportations. Historians estimate the death toll somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. Many governments and historians today formally call this event a genocide. The Turkish government disputes both that term and the scale of the killing. It remains one of the most contested and painful events in Ottoman history. The empire ended the war on the losing side, exhausted and deeply in debt. Allied forces occupied its capital city soon after the fighting stopped. In 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres proposed dividing almost all remaining Ottoman land among the winners. Britain, France, Greece, and other powers were set to take the pieces. So why did an empire that lasted 623 years end this quickly? The obvious answer is that it lost a war. But that answer misses most of the real story. Losing the war did not create the empire's weaknesses. It exposed weaknesses that had been building for well over 200 years. By 1914, roughly a third of all Ottoman government revenue was already set aside just to pay foreign debt. The empire had also lost around 85% of its European territory in the Balkan Wars alone. That happened before the First World War had even started. The war, then, was not the true cause of the collapse. It was the final event in a much longer story of decline. Decades of debt, lost territory, and internal division had already stripped away most of the empire's strength. The war simply finished what had already been underway for generations. Compare this to how the empire looked in the year 1500. Back then, it had almost no foreign debt at all. It controlled its own tax collection completely. Its army was considered one of the most feared in the world. By 1914, every one of those advantages had been reversed. The empire owed money it could not repay. Foreign officials collected its taxes. Its army was still large, but it was underfunded and outdated compared to its rivals. Here is the real lesson buried inside this story. An empire can survive losing battles for centuries at a time. The Ottomans did exactly that, again and again, for hundreds of years. But an empire cannot survive losing control of its own money and its own borders at the same time. That specific combination is what actually brought this empire down. The empire's ending was not one single clean moment. It happened in several separate pieces, spread out over a few years. The first ending came on November 1st, 1922. On that day, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished by the new Turkish parliament. It closed out more than 600 years of continuous rule by a single family line. But that was not the only ending this empire had. A military leader named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, had already led a separate war of independence. It ran from 1919 to 1923, fought largely against occupying Allied forces. He fought against that occupation and against the partition plan laid out in the Treaty of Sèvres. On October 29, 1923, he declared the founding of the Republic of Turkey. There was a third ending too, and it is often forgotten entirely. The Ottoman Caliphate was the empire's religious authority, kept separate from its political rule. That caliphate was not abolished until March of 1924, under the new Turkish Republic. That came a full 16 months after the Sultanate itself had already ended. And the empire's former territory in the Middle East did not simply become free and independent. Instead, it was divided into British and French mandates under a League of Nations agreement. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine were carved out and placed under foreign control. In many cases, these new borders were straight lines drawn on a map. The officials drawing them had often never visited the region. They paid little attention to existing tribal, religious, or ethnic boundaries on the ground. Many of today's regional conflicts trace their roots directly back to how those new borders were drawn. This was not a clean resolution to centuries of history. It was a brand new set of unresolved problems, layered directly on top of an old one. It's also worth remembering that several nations had left the empire decades earlier, through their own separate wars of independence. Greece, Serbia, and Romania were already gone long before 1922 arrived. The empire did not end in one single moment at all. It ended in pieces, spread out over more than 100 years of history. So here is what actually happened, told in one breath. A small frontier state in Anatolia grew, over a century and a half, into an empire spanning 3 continents. That empire built one of the most stable multi-religious systems anywhere in the world at the time. It ran its own courts, raised its own armies, and controlled its own money for hundreds of years. Then, over the next 200 years, it slowly lost land. It lost control of its own finances. It lost the loyalty of many peoples living inside its own borders. A single war in 1914 did not start that long process of decline. It finished it. 623 years of history did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It came apart in stages, each stage setting up the next, until there was finally nothing left to hold together. Almost every trace of the old system was gone within a few short years. The Sultan was gone. The Caliphate was gone. The debt administration was gone, replaced by a new republic determined to control its own finances. What remained was not one empire, but more than a dozen separate countries, each working out its own future. That is why an empire that outlasted nearly every rival it ever faced still could not survive the 20th century. And that is why the borders it left behind are still being argued over today.